Hi, this is the third in the series of 3 talks on the fundamentals of strengthening a research submission. The previous 2 were on abstract and best journal. The C for this final talk is the cover letter. So important, but so often neglected. Recall that we spoke earlier about the fact that many journals will make an initial decision based on a master reading of your cover letter and abstract. We also talked about the fact that abstracts, the subject of the first talk, have different roles from cover letters. Whereas the abstract explains the details of your research and findings, it is the cover letter that explains to an editor why your research is important to that journal's readership. So the cover letter serves an important function, and that is to get your manuscript read. Most cover letters, sadly, do not do justice to the manuscript. I think that a few simple tips can make the difference between having your manuscript read and having it rejected. So write the cover letter with that in mind. Think of the reader, and this time, the reader is the editor. So think of the editor as you write. So compose your letter to answer what he or she needs to know about the manuscript. Make the reader want to learn more. At The Lancet, we have a system of editorial triage, and a senior editor will look at the manuscripts that come in, reading the abstract and the cover letter, blinded to the origin of that paper. And on those reads, make a decision about whether the manuscript should be referred to an editor for a full reading, or whether there's enough information in the abstract and the cover letter to reject the manuscript or pass it to one of our 11 family member journals. So in making that decision, as an editor, I want to know, why are these findings of interest to our readers? Is it novel? That is it the beginning of a story of science, or is it the end of a chapter? Does it consolidate our understanding? Is the methodology appropriate, and is it robust? Will it change practice? Because we want to change practice. We want good science to improve people's lives. So we want an end result from the manuscript. And I think the cover letter is your opportunity to mention any special factors. When writing the cover letter, you want to be brief, less than 300 words, but not so brief as to deny yourself the opportunity to write a convincing argument on behalf of your submission. Demonstrate an understanding of the journal, an appreciation of why your research is important to those readers. Certainly summarize the findings, but don't repeat the entire abstract, because, of course, the abstract is going to be separate and will also be seen by the editor. And let the data speak for themselves. It would be wrong to suggest in the cover letter implications of your research that are not borne out in the full manuscript. A simple template is on the slide in front of you. In terms of a greeting, if you have a specific name, that's great, because as a triage editor, if I see a specific name, I will immediately pass the manuscript on to that individual. If you don't have a name, then I suggest a generic name such as Dear Editor is absolutely fine. If you can, it's good to set the stage at the beginning of the cover letter. So you might want to write saying, in response to some event, some publication, we are pleased to submit our manuscript on, then provide details of the manuscript and all supporting material for your consideration. That simple line of saying that you're submitting the supporting material sends 2 messages to me. First of all, it says that you've looked at the requirements of the journal, so you've taken time to consider the journal. And secondly, that you're organized to have that material together. That means it's likely that your manuscript will be a well-organized one as well. I would then make a statement about why you think the paper will be of interest to those readers. Certainly, it's worthwhile mentioning the journal name in this context, but it's worth bearing in mind that if you're not successful with your first submission, you will want to change the journal name, also the editor name, for your next try at another journal. Because The Lancet is a clinical journal, we'd be interested in understanding why it's of clinical importance, what the topicality is. You may wish to set your work into context by saying that it builds on or responds to some other event, and then to briefly summarize the intervention and the result. Then recall from the abstract section, it was important to talk about the implications of research. This is also where you can talk about how your research is going to inform practice, whether this be in the clinic or health policy, and where that might be. If it's going to be locally or internationally, within certain health systems, or within certain socioeconomic or geographic settings. If your manuscript is timed for a meeting, do mention here when it is being presented. And you may wish also to say whether this is the first submission of your manuscript or if it's been submitted elsewhere, and what the history of that submission was. I'll now go through some slides that show you in a little bit more detail some of these constituent parts. If you're addressing the letter to a particular editor, it's important to explain why. Perhaps you had sent in an email earlier asking if the journal would be interested. That's an excellent introduction to your manuscript, and it also serves to refresh the memory of the editor. Perhaps this is following a visit, or you might have been at a meeting when an editor expressed a certain interest in some type of manuscript. So it's a very useful way of personalizing your submission, but it's good to have some connection there, so why you've chosen that particular editor is clear. In providing medical context, there are all sorts of ways to do this. You may wish to look at the burden of disease, perhaps in terms of epidemiology or disability or cost. Perhaps in terms of existing treatments, whether there are treatments, what their shortfalls might be that your manuscript addresses. If it's evolving science, that's important too. Translational medicine is a highly sought after area by journals. If you're offering new insights, then say so in the cover letter. In terms of external context, if it's linked to a recent or an upcoming event, then please give details. This might be a health crisis, a policy statement, some meeting, or the anniversary of an event. For instance, last year, as we had the 10th anniversary of SARS, you will have noticed that there were publications in several journals about that. There may be an internal context to strengthen your submission, and the cover letter provides you an opportunity to articulate that. Perhaps the journal has had a call for papers, in which case the first sentence should be in response to the call for papers. Maybe you're responding to something the journal has published. That could be research, an editorial, or something the journal hasn't published. You may wish to point out to the editor that there is a gap within the journal and that your submission helps to fill that gap. Getting on to the importance of your manuscript in the cover letter, it's important to say why it's important, to whom and where, and how that particular group relates to the journal's readership. A cover letter that says, I want to publish this in Journal X really doesn't thrill an editor. What I much prefer to see would be a cover letter that said something along the lines of, "This research can change clinical practice, and Journal X is the most direct way to share these findings with the key practitioners who can implement change." Both statements express the same wish. The second statement helps the editor to understand why. You may wish to mention in the cover letter the length of the manuscript, perhaps to say that it's within journal guidelines. If you find that your manuscript is too long, then it could be wise to consider having a supplemental appendix to put extra details in. And the cover letter can say, because of the journal's preference for length, you have put extra material in the supplemental appendix that you hope will be of use to editors, reviewers, and readers in terms of understanding the work. You could mention in the cover letter that you followed the appropriate reporting guidelines. That sends a strong signal of organization to the editor. Registration is something we're very keen on, and that can be for any type of study, not only a randomized controlled trial. And finally, you may wish to mention the supplemental materials that you've also included. If there are unusual aspects of your submission, the cover letter is the time to mention them rather than to hide and pretend that they won't be detected. For instance, if there are any particular issues regarding the Institutional Review Board approval, why ethics were raised, the acquisition of consent, if there's been a reporting delay, or protocol alterations. Certainly one would expect to see them in the manuscript, but if there is an important story to tell behind them, the cover letter is the place to say it. A simple example might be, this research was completed last year, the corresponding author has been on maternity leave since then. No one is going to raise an eyebrow about the delay in reporting under circumstances like that. An equally long delay in reporting with no exclamation may make people wonder. I'm often asked, should you mention reviewers when you submit the cover letter? This will depend on the journal that you're submitting to. Many submission systems will ask for reviewers. If you're asked, it's entirely reasonable to provide them. I think it's important, if you do provide a recommended reviewer, that you explain why they have been recommended. This also applies to those people who you would prefer not to review your manuscript because, for instance, they may be in competing studies. But in both cases, I would urge discretion. And when it comes to closing the cover letter, the closure of a letter is the flavor that you leave with the reader. And I think it's always nice to see a consensual closure, perhaps writing on behalf of the authors, expressing flexibility, re-emphasizing the patient-centeredness of your work if it's clinical work. And unless they're deal breakers, I think there are a lot of minor issues that can be left out of the cover letter and can be dealt with later. For instance, the cover letter is not the time to discuss how you would like to organize the press release. So keep the reader in mind, be clear, and remember, the reader this time is an editor. So if you're applying to a general medical journal, be careful not to overestimate the specialist knowledge of the editor. And that also applies to common abbreviations within a specialty. So in fact, I would recommend minimizing abbreviations in both the cover letter and in the manuscript, because the same abbreviation can mean different things in different specialties. Likewise, good to avoid jargon, both in the cover letter and the manuscript. And finally, coming back to length. as short as necessary to interest, but not so long that you overwhelm the editor. 250, 300 words is a really nice size, and it's a comfortable read in which you can convey a lot of information. On the screen now is an example of what I think is a very good cover letter from Asia. This is a vaccine trial, as you will see, and the cover letter begins by setting the context. EV71 infection, the author writes, is an important public health issue in Asia-Pacific region and beyond. So immediately, as an editor of The Lancet, I see that this is of relevance, both as a topic and because of the audience involved. The author goes on to write about the clinical spectrum of EV71, its severity, the fact that in the 2001 to 2011 outbreak, there were 1.6 million cases and 500 deaths in China. Now my interest is really raised. If I didn't know before, I now know that this is a serious disease burden. Again, that re-emphasizes the importance of the paper to the readership of The Lancet. So I'm paying closer and closer attention as I read the cover letter and get to the next section. I'm thinking to myself, with such an illness, a viral illness affecting children, why isn't there a vaccine? I then read, the development of a vaccine against EV71 is a dynamic topic with paramount relevance for public health. So I'm asking myself, I wonder if this is the paper that's going to tell me about that vaccine. The authors go on to say, the phase 2 clinical trial, they provide a registration number, reported here, is written according to consort guidelines. Terrific. So at this stage, I know it's an important topic, I know it's done well, I know it's registered, I know it's reported according to consort. So I've moved on in my thinking. I'm not thinking as a triage editor of does this journal need to be assigned to an editor and read. I'm already thinking, before I finish the cover letter, about who I'm going to invite as a reviewer for this manuscript. And that's the purpose of the cover letter, so that by the time the editor finishes reading it, the editor is thinking that they want to get this manuscript peer-reviewed, not just read, but that they can begin to imagine it within the journal. Some journals are part of a larger publishing group. So an obvious question is, would you want your manuscript passed on to a related journal within that group? For instance, at The Lancet, we have the weekly General Medical Journal and monthly specialist journals in infectious diseases, neurology, oncology, respiratory medicine, global health, diabetes and endocrinology, psychiatry, HIV, hematology, eBiomedicine, which is a translational science journal started between ourselves and Cell Press. And coming in 2016, we'll be launching The Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology. In the future, it's very likely other titles will be added to this. So by having that option available, a manuscript can first be considered for the weekly, and then, if the author approves, that manuscript might be passed on to one of the more specialized journals if the feeling of the editors is it's a more appropriate audience. The advantage to you, of course, is that any peer reviews and notes that are done travel internally with the manuscript. So if there are other journals within a publishing organization, it may be worth mentioning that in the cover letter you'd be happy to pass the manuscript on. So in summary, the key points for a cover letter are keep it short and keep it relevant. Use the opportunity to persuade editors of the importance of your paper to that journal's readership and provide context for any irregularities. So if we draw these three talks together, the ABCs, think about submission when planning your research, and pay attention to the abstract, selecting the best journal, and the cover letter. Thank you, and happy writing.